Imagine a country with zero natural resources. No oil, no farmland, not even a reliable source of fresh water. A country so small, you could drive across it in 30 minutes. A country that the founding Prime Minister of Malaysia publicly called, and I am not making this up, a little red. Now imagine every empire in history, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the Japanese, and even the United States, all desperately wanting to control it, and every single one of them ultimately failing. This is the story of Singapore, the most strategically valuable piece of land on Earth, and the story of how a city-state smaller than New York figured out how to bend the world's greatest powers to its will without firing a single bullet. Before we go further, you need to understand one thing. Singapore's power has never come from its size. It has always come from its location. Look at a map. Right at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, sits a tiny island, barely 50 kilometers wide. Every ship traveling from Europe to China, from the Middle East to Japan, from India to Southeast Asia, every single one of them has to pass through the Strait of Malacca. And Singapore sits right at the mouth of that strait like a toll booth on the world's busiest highway. Control Singapore, and you control the flow of global trade. That's not an exaggeration. Today, over 40% of the world's container shipping passes through this strait. And for the last 600 years, every great power on Earth has looked at that map and thought the exact same thought. We need that island. But here's what they never understood. Singapore wasn't just a place to be taken. It was a place that could take back. The Portuguese arrive, 1511. The first Europeans to truly understand Singapore's value were the Portuguese. In 1511, they conquered Malacca, the great trading port just north of Singapore, and they built a maritime empire that stretched from Lisbon to Macau. They weren't subtle about it. Their strategy was simple. Control the choke point, tax every ship, and grow rich. For over a century, it worked. But the Portuguese had a fatal weakness. They were a small nation trying to hold an empire that spanned the globe. And 6,000 miles from home, rebellions are expensive. The Dutch watched, and the Dutch learned. The Dutch Empire takes over, 1641. By 1641, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had driven the Portuguese out of Malacca. This was no ordinary company. The VOC had its own army, its own navy, and the legal right to wage war. It was the world's first multinational corporation, and it was utterly ruthless. For 150 years, the Dutch dominated trade across Southeast Asia. They built forts. They imposed monopolies. They executed competitors. And for a time, it seemed like nobody could stop them. But the Dutch made a critical error. They focused on control through force rather than value through trade. They taxed merchants so heavily that traders began finding other routes, other ports, other ways around the Dutch stranglehold. Empires built on coercion always have the same problem. The moment you show weakness, everyone runs for the exit. And then came the British. And everything changed. The British, 1819. In 1819, a British colonial officer named Stamford Raffles stepped off a boat onto a small, swampy island that had no more than 1,000 inhabitants. He looked around. He looked at the maps. And he immediately understood what the Portuguese and Dutch had spent centuries fighting over. Raffles didn't just want a military base. He wanted a free port. No taxes. No tariffs. No restrictions on who could trade there. Within 3 years of that decision, Singapore went from a fishing village to one of the busiest ports in Asia. This was genius. Where the Dutch had tried to control trade by squeezing it, the British let it flow and took their cut from the sheer volume. Within a generation, Singapore had become the crown jewel of the British Empire in Asia. By 1900, it was one of the most important ports in the world. The British were so confident in Singapore that they built a massive naval base there and declared it the Gibraltar of the East. Impregnable. Unconquerable. They were wrong. Japan destroys the myth, 1942. On February 15, 1942, British General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore to the Japanese military. It was the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. 80,000 soldiers. Gone. Here's the part that makes it even more humiliating. The British had built massive naval guns to defend Singapore, but they were all pointing south toward the sea. The Japanese simply invaded from the north, coming through the Malay jungle on bicycles. On bicycles, the greatest naval fortress in Asia fell in 70 days. The myth of British invincibility died in Singapore. And something else died with it. The idea that any foreign power could truly hold this island against its will. Japan occupied Singapore for 3.5 brutal years. The occupation was savage, particularly toward the Chinese population. Tens of thousands were killed in the Suk Ching massacres. The trauma of those years would shape Singapore's entire approach to the world long after the war ended. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the British came back. But something had fundamentally shifted. The people of Singapore had seen the British defeated, humiliated, and driven out. The age of unquestioned colonial rule was over. The birth of a nation nobody wanted, 1965. After the war, the British slowly withdrew from Asia. Singapore gained self-governance in 1959 under a fierce young lawyer named Kuan Yew. And in 1963, Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia, briefly becoming part of a larger country. It lasted 2 years. On August 9, 1965, Kuan Yew stood before cameras and announced, through tears, that Singapore had been expelled from Malaysia, not chosen to leave. Expelled. The Malay-dominated government in Kuala Lumpur didn't want a Chinese majority city in their federation. Singapore was on its own. Kuan Yew later said it was a moment of anguish. Because what did Singapore have? No water, no food, no army, no resources, surrounded by larger neighbors who were, at best, indifferent, and at worst, hostile. What would you do? Kuan Yew's masterstroke. What happened next is one of the greatest strategic turnarounds in modern history. Kuan Yew looked at Singapore's vulnerabilities and decided to turn every single one of them into a weapon. No natural resources? Fine. Singapore would become a hub for everyone else's resources. It built the largest oil refinery complex in Southeast Asia, refining crude oil from the Middle East and selling it back to the world. It built one of the world's greatest container ports. It made itself the place where global trade had to stop. No food or water. Singapore signed agreements with Malaysia for water and simultaneously began investing in desalination and water recycling. Today, Singapore's water technology is so advanced that it exports water solutions to the entire world. What was a vulnerability became an industry. No army. In 1967, Singapore introduced compulsory military service and built one of the most sophisticated armed forces in Asia, proportional to its size, arguably the most capable military in the region. And it bought advanced American F-16s, Israeli-developed weapons systems, and U.S.-trained officers. And that brings us to the most important question. What did the Americans want from all this? The American angle. The United States, fresh from the Cold War and the Vietnam disaster, desperately needed a stable, pro-Western anchor in Southeast Asia. Singapore was perfectly positioned, geographically, ideologically, and economically. Kuan Yew understood this. He let American warships use Singapore's port facilities. He welcomed U.S. investment. He built an economy so intertwined with America's interests that Washington had every reason to want Singapore to succeed. But, and this is critical, he never became a servant. When American officials lectured Singapore on democracy or human rights, Kuan Yew pushed back. Publicly. Forcefully. He told the United States that Asian values and Western liberal democracy were not the same thing, and that Singapore would run its government the way Singapore saw fit. The Americans grumbled, and then they kept using the port. Singapore had figured out the formula. Make yourself indispensable to the powerful, but never make yourself dependent on them. It's a formula that no empire before had fully understood. What Singapore became. Let's talk about the results. Because the numbers are staggering. In 1965, Singapore's per capita GDP was roughly $500 per year, lower than many African nations at the time. Today, Singapore's per capita GDP is over $65,000, higher than the United States, higher than Germany, higher than Japan. In one generation, from a fishing village to one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. How? By being smarter than everyone who ever tried to control it. Singapore became the financial capital of Southeast Asia, a regulated, transparent, corruption-free environment in a region where that was rare. It became the logistics hub of global trade. Nearly a quarter of the world's ship repair work is done here. It became a technology and pharmaceutical hub, home to the Asian headquarters of Google, Apple, Facebook, and dozens of the world's largest companies. Singapore did not win by having resources. It won by being the most essential place on earth for the people who did. The China question, today's test. But Singapore's greatest strategic test is happening right now, because China has risen. And China, like every empire before it, looks at Singapore and thinks, we need that. 60% of Singapore's population is ethnically Chinese. China has tried to leverage this, suggesting that Singapore has a natural cultural and political loyalty to Beijing. Singapore's response was immediate and unambiguous. No, we are Singaporeans. Ethnicity is not foreign policy. At the same time, China is Singapore's largest trading partner. You cannot simply tell your biggest customer to go away. So Singapore does what it has always done. It maintains relationships with every great power simultaneously, plays none of them against each other directly, and keeps itself positioned as the neutral ground where deals get made. Singapore hosts U.S. military access agreements. It trades deeply with China. It maintains strong ties to India, the EU, Japan, and ASEAN simultaneously. It has made itself too valuable to be the enemy of anyone. If that sounds difficult, it is. But no nation on earth is better at it. So what can the world learn from Singapore? The lesson is not about size. It is not about resources. It is about clarity of purpose and refusal to be defined by other people's categories. Every empire that tried to control Singapore made the same mistake. They assumed that power comes from having things: land, oil, armies, populations. Singapore proved that power comes from being necessary, from being the place where things happen that cannot happen anywhere else, from making yourself so useful to so many different actors that none of them can afford to make you an enemy. There is a second lesson, just as important. Singapore's leaders never confused short-term comfort with long-term survival. Kuan Yew made decisions that were deeply unpopular, cracking down on corruption with zero tolerance, forcing citizens to save for retirement through a mandatory fund, restricting political opposition. You can debate those choices. Many people do, but the results are undeniable. Singapore has zero tolerance for dysfunction because it knows that dysfunction is a luxury that small nations cannot afford. And the third lesson is perhaps the most powerful of all. Never let anyone else define what you are. The Portuguese called the region a trade route. The Dutch called it a monopoly. The British called it a fortress. The Malaysians called it a problem. The Americans called it an ally. Japan called it a conquest. Singapore called itself a nation. And that made all the difference. Singapore is not finished writing its story. The world is changing. AI, climate change, U.S.-China rivalry, shifting trade routes. Every generation of Singaporeans will face its own version of the same question that Raffles faced in 1819 and Lee Kuan Yew faced in 1965. How do you survive and thrive in a world that is always bigger than you? Singapore has answered that question better than any nation in history. And the rest of the world is still catching up. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe. We cover the geopolitics, economics, and hidden strategies that shape our world every single week. And drop a comment. What do you think Singapore's biggest challenge over the next 20 years will be? I read every single one. See you in the next one.